Well, thank you, Sean, for that gracious introduction. After that introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say. Thank you very much. And Bob, thank you for inviting me. It is my pleasure to be here with you. And I say that not only because, obviously that's the sort of thing you're supposed to say at the beginning of sessions like this, but I mean this. I admire what you do at the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence. It's not only good for the people in practice, it's good for the people in academia, it's good for the community. More and more places should do it. And in that real sense, it's a pleasure to be with you. Now, a couple of things. One is because of the setup of the room, I don't know if those of you on that side, the tables over there, can see the slides. When you finish your breakfast, if you want to get up, there's a number of empty seats here. Just do it. I'm not going to feel dissed or anything like that. So do it. Let me explain what I'm going to talk with you about this morning, and at least the going in agenda. All right. And then, as with all audiences, you'll decide what the de facto agenda is. Is there some reason the clicker isn't working here? Batteries. Hey, see, 21st century. Let's see, what happens if no, it's not working on the computer as well. Can I ask the people who set up everything and worked beautifully 10 minutes ago to fix it now? Let's see here. Was it something I said? There we go. All right, here's the going in agenda. What I'm going to do is use some data and research from the script, from the book that Sean alluded to do a few things. I want to discuss what is and what is not changing in business development. And by the way, when I use the word sales, that's what I mean. By sales, and at the end of the day, I'm at a point in my career where I honestly do not give a darn whether we call it sales, marketing, or asparagus. I mean business development. How do you get and keep customers? That's the way I'm using the word sales. I want to talk a little bit about what is and is not changing in this area, because quite honestly, I think there's a tremendous amount of nonsense and mythology that currently surrounds this topic. And I think, as I'll show you, I think the pandemic has accelerated the nonsense and mythology. So let me show you some data, all right? I also want to say a few things, especially to this group, about why knowing the difference between fact and myth, reality and hearsay really makes a difference in sales and business development. I'm going to spend about, I don't know, it'll take 25, 30 minutes for me to sort of cover those first 2 points. Then I'm going to stop. Questions, comments, disagreements. Hey, Frank, what about this? What about that? And we will go as long as we need to with that. But then I'm going to make some suggestions about 3 key areas in sales and business development: people, hiring and training, performance management. I'll give you my upfront advice right now. You want to make your sales force better? Make sure your managers take performance reviews seriously. And the irony here is this is a very trainable skill. It's not metaphysics. And most sales managers do what I call drive-by reviews. Not a good thing. And I want to say a few things about productivity in sales. Then I'll stop again. Questions, comments, disagreements. But throughout, just raise your hand. All right, I'm not gonna cold call. Ben Rizzo was in one of my classes at HBS. Don't worry, there's no cold calls today. So you just raise your hand whenever. But as well, I hope, as doing a reasonable job of keeping you engaged for 90 minutes, my objective here is what I assume is the objective of every session at the Institute, provide you with some useful inputs to your dialogue, the follow-up to the script. As Sean said, your dialogue with your people about growth challenges and opportunities in your business, all right? So let me jump into this. What I'm going to be talking about is, quote, yet another book about sales. And I frame it that way because if you go to Amazon and you go to the book section, and in the search bar you put in sales, out will come about 85,000 stock keeping units, all right? As far as I can tell, the only management topic that gets more SKUs in Amazon is, quote, leadership. It gets about 90,000, but sales is a very, very close second. Now, you may be familiar with the old aphorism, no single drop of rain ever feels responsible for the flood, right? So, you know, why? Why have I decided to contribute to this tsunami? And basically, I've got two motivations in writing this book. The first one is fundamentally a professional, intellectual motivation. Of all the various elements in the so-called value chain, I'm going to use that business school jargon. You all know what value chain refers to. It's basically jargon for referring to all the activities that any company has to do, you know, from sourcing, adding value to whatever they source, raw materials, information, selling, service, et cetera. Of all the elements in the value chain, sales is by far the most context specific, right? Selling software is different than selling capital goods, is different than selling professional services, et cetera. Selling 5, 6, 7-year licensed software is different than selling SaaS. It also depends on the context in which you're selling it. It's culturally dependent. Selling in North America is different than selling in Latin America or Asia. The good news about academia when it comes to this topic is because of the resurgence of interest in entrepreneurialism, sales has moved up. Trust me, I used to be the lone voice in the wilderness at HBS, but sales has moved up in the status hierarchy. That's the good news. The bad news is, and you know, our school's a good example, 45% of our students are from outside the United States. The bad news is it's very, very not only US centric, but Silicon Valley US centric. And I feel bad for our international students, because if you seriously expect to do what some of these people tell you to do in selling in India or Japan or the Middle East, you're going to get tossed out of the room. So it's a very, very context-specific activity, but for some reason, it's a topic where people feel most comfortable making these huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any empirical data whatsoever, except what in academia we would call N equals 1, right? When I sold for Oracle, this is what worked for me. It's what you should do, even though I haven't sold in 10 years, right? Or, you know, those of you who deal with investors, VCs, who've never carried a bag. When we invested in PayPal, that kind of stuff. So as somebody who's run a business for 11 years, had to meet payroll every month, somebody who I think has done reasonable research in this area for 30 years, I wanted to write a book that says, look, this is what research does and does not tell you about this core activity in business. The other motivation is I think it's a particularly good time for a book like this. There is no doubt whatsoever that digital online technologies, the sustained data revolution that will continue and probably accelerate throughout our careers, there's no doubt those things are affecting buying and selling. But again, my reading of what people say about this is they simply do not understand the managerial context in which these activities occur. And I think the pandemic has raised the stakes for getting this right. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm getting at. What I've got at the top of this slide, this is where seeing the slides will be helpful, by the way, if you want to move. What I've got at the top of this slide is what I hope you would agree is a very, very common assertion during the last 2 years. I mean, I'm happy to name names. You know, I got tenure. I dare you. Come try to get me. All right. But you know, I get an email. For some reason, I'm on McKinsey's email list. I get probably 2-3 emails a week from McKinsey with some form of this assertion that e-commerce means the decline, or as we would now say in the current jargon, the disintermediation of the salesperson, and the pandemic makes this a so-called new normal. All right. Now here's the data. The e-commerce is not new. E-commerce has been around for over 35 years. Books.com was selling books online nationally while Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, was still working for a hedge fund on Wall Street, all right? After more than 3 decades, essentially free from sales taxes, e-commerce as a percentage of total US retail sales just before the pandemic was about 11.5%, right? Now, when I ask executives, when I don't show them that number, and I say, what do you think that number was? I typically get estimates from 30 to 60%. In other words, executives are not a little bit out of touch with the buying reality. They're very often orders of magnitude out of touch. Now, what's happened during the pandemic? Obviously, or at least it seems obvious to me, that when stores are closed or when they're held to 25 to 50% of their capacity, when many people legitimately feel that if they go into a store, they may catch a virus and die, obviously there's going to be more buying and selling that occurs online. What I want you to look at is the number for the second quarter of 2020, because thus far, let's cross our fingers and hope for the best. Thus far, that was maximum lockdown conditions in the United States. And even in those maximum lockdown conditions, e-commerce as a percentage of total retail sales, 15.7%. In other words, it went up 5%. And it's been trending down every quarter since then. The latest data was Q3 of 2021. Q4 will be out in about 3 weeks, down to 13%. Same is true from work from home, right? It spiked up to about 38% in the second quarter of 2020, down 18% a year later. Now, the point, this is a little bit off topic, but I want to make this because you people, most of you own your business, right? You're not playing this as a game. This is your money, your time, your career, your life. It is very important to allocate resources in line with market reality. And what I want to suggest to you is that the vast majority of these so-called new normal predictions that you're hearing are nonsense. By far, the best thing that I have read about this is by a British historian. His name is Stephen Davies. You can actually download this. It's a book called The History and Economics of Pandemics. And Davies' conclusion, and he'll show you the data, you know, it's not like these pandemics are new. They happen every 100 years. His conclusion is that a major pandemic does not introduce something truly novel. A lot of this talk about innovation is basically cheerleading, right? And the reason is that, and you know, think about your own business, right? I'm on boards. I saw what happened in the second quarter of 2020. It was not a talk about innovation. It was a talk about survival. You batten down the hatches. You're not really doing new things. But what a major pandemic does is magnify trends that were already underway. And that's what's happening as we speak. And the biggest trend is that what the pandemic has done is accelerate trends about buying that have been true and growing for at least the past decade. Omni-channel buying, but what it's also done is made online marketing channels increasingly cluttered, expensive, and a classic example of what economists call the law of diminishing returns. Let me show you some of the data there. The reality is that usage on the major social media platforms had been flat for 5 years before the pandemic and had declined among people less than 35 years old. Now compare that empirical data to all these generalizations you hear about millennials, all right? This is the data. The only age group using Facebook, for example, more before the pandemic was people like me, people 55 years and older. And what were they doing? Hey, remember when we got stoned at that Grateful Dead concert? I'm not sure what the marketing value of that is, all right? One of the things that has stoked a lot of interest in online channels is the notion of virality. You know, tech people love to come up with their own words for stuff that we've known for 100 years. We used to call it word of mouth. Now we say virality, all right? I post something, it goes viral, millions of people see it, and I haven't spent much money on marketing, right? That's the notion. I have a colleague, his name's Sunil Gupta, who looks at this very closely, and this is what Gupta's data tells you. 90% of online messages do not diffuse at all. They go nowhere. Only about 4% are shared even once, and less than 1% get shared more than 7 times. Now, there's this notion, which I think is true. Sociologists call this the Megaphone Effect, that one of the things social media has done is, in effect, create spaces where you can talk to people who already agree with you, right? That's the Megaphone Effect. And I think that's true. I think it has, something to do with our political polarization and so forth. But what Sunil's data shows you is that most of these people, 90%, are just talking to themselves, right? Not even other people. There's increased awareness during the pandemic of cybersecurity, Zoom bombing issues, regulatory actions about privacy in the EU, almost certainly in the United States. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. Once you're elected, you don't want people talking to each other. You want to be reelected. It's in their interest to put this in place. And when you've already got a major share like Google and Facebook, regulatory actions are your friend. So I think you're going to see much more of this cloaked with sanctimonious rhetoric. The point I want to make to a group like this, where you're, most of you are not Amazon or Google, you're running small businesses. Online marketing is now basically a big numbers, deep pockets game where it's also very high maintenance. Ongoing knowledge of algorithms and segments across multiple platforms is required, and those platforms come and go. How many of you could even spell TikTok as recently as 2 years ago? And there will be others. The joke that people in tech have been making for the last few months, where's the best place to bury a body? Page 2 of Amazon or Google. Nobody goes there, right? That's where you're going to find Jimmy Hoffa, all right? So I think this is the reality about online marketing. Keep it in mind when you hear all these generalizations about the pandemic and virtual selling and inbound marketing models, et cetera. Now, why does this matter? Why, beyond flunking some professor's test about e-commerce as a percentage of sales, why should we care about this? I think we should care about this for a number of reasons, many of which get to the heart of what you do for a living, right? Because what you do for a living is fundamentally about profitable growth. In business, in politics, you can get away with this. Politics, you can make stuff up. But in business, if you don't separate fact from hype, then in any competitive market, a couple of bad things are going to happen. You'll make bad or at least suboptimal decisions about priorities, about how to allocate resources. You can initiate a self-fulfilling prophecy. getting better and better at stuff that customers value less and less. I would suggest, and again, if I'm offending somebody in the room because you make your living this way, hey, all I can say is come get me, all right? What can I say? I've got the tenure. I would suggest this is exactly what's happening with digital marketing groups in many, many companies. And once you put groups like that in place, they're not going to look at the data and say, wow, the ROI here is really disappointing. I think I'll go in the back room and commit suicide. No, they're going to come up with different metrics. And that's exactly what we see happening. You can talk all you want about disruption, but you need a relevant go-to-market model to do disruption or avoid it. And then again, in any competitive market, you eventually fall victim to those who can separate fact from hype and manage it. I think this matters for a couple of other reasons as well. Now, this is data about companies in general, but if you think about strategy, and that, by the way, is the real wake-up call from the pandemic. Many companies have to rethink business strategy. It is tough. It's just tough to get sustained things done well in business without a strategy, right? But if you think about strategy, sales for the vast majority of companies is by far the most expensive part of executing a business strategy. Let me show you some numbers and put them in context. This first number is surprisingly difficult to get. It took a bunch of research, but as best I can tell, globally, firms spend about $100 billion annually on strategy. You know, hiring consulting firms, et cetera, right? Sounds like a lot of money. On the other hand, US firms alone, typically before the pandemic, spend about $900 billion annually. I want to remind you, annually means every year, on sales forces. What's in that number? Sales comp, right? Travel and entertainment, training, and the attributed back office IT expenses from CRM systems, et cetera. Now, to put this in context, this is more than 3 times their total spending on all media, including digital this and digital that. On average, firms invest about 10% of revenues, 1 out of every $10 on sales. And by the way, the percentage has been increasing throughout the 21st century, not decreasing. And it's even more important for entrepreneurial ventures. We are at the Institute, and let me show you some of the data about entrepreneurial ventures. The first bit of data here, I think we all understand intuitively. Starting a business means risk. It's not easy. Less than 50% of all new businesses succeed in getting a customer, any customer, within 3 years. All right, that's the data from the Kauffman Foundation. But here's the most important data that I think is most relevant to what we're about today. It's even tougher to scale a business. I mean, the reality in new business ventures, I see this at Harvard Business School where, you know, the PE people and the VC people are, you know, they grow on trees there, to be blunt. It has never been easier to raise money for a business. And it's never been harder to scale the business. And what the data tells you, and again, these are firms that have professional investors behind them. Now, my experience, you know, I teach in, my major teaching assignment for the last few years has been a program at Harvard we call OPM, Owner, President, Manager. They're people like you, people that have had to do it on their own, running small businesses. And what I've noticed in that program is most of the attendees are what I call investor bigots. They hate the VCs and PE people. Hey, you take other people's money, you've given up some freedom. Understand the way the world works as an adult, but they are professional investors. During their lifetime, they see 10 to 20 to 30 times more businesses than anyone running a single business does. But if you look at the track record for professional investors of firms in the Venture Expert database since 2000, right? That's 20 years. Only 1% of those firms ever reach $10 million in sales. Unicorns are still the major exception. They're not the rule. The Capital IQ database is about 3 times the size of the Venture Expert database. Less than 6% reached $10 million in sales within 10 years. And that's been true in the next 10 years as well. And for tech ventures, I don't know how many of you are in that space, this data is even more dramatic and relevant, because in most software ventures, it's like the pharmaceutical business. Once you've developed the software, that fixed cost has low marginal costs of additional production. And the big expense is ongoing sales and marketing expense. To the extent, now you're all going to laugh, but this is the current environment in which we live in. I work, I'm on the advisory boards of directors of a couple of VC and PE firms. And I was at a presentation earlier this month where the company pitching for money, their big metric they were pitching is what they called EBITDA Ma. Have you heard this? EBITDA Ma. In other words, this is what our EBITDA would be if you took out the money we're spending on marketing. That's the Ma part, which for this firm was about 55%. So I said, excuse me, are you saying that if in fact you were 8 feet tall, you could then play in the NBA? And this entrepreneur with no irony whatsoever said, that's right, right? EBITDA Ma, all right? So again, this is what's happening. Now, I also want to make a prediction about what we're likely to see when in fact we do get over the variants. The reality is the pandemic has not been an equal opportunity plague. There are some businesses, tech businesses, where it's frankly been the best thing that ever happened to them. And then there are other businesses, services businesses, right? The reason this is such a big deal, 70% of the GDP in the United States is services businesses, but the hotel businesses, convening businesses, it's been very, very difficult. But if you've been lucky because of what you produced during the pandemic, I think you're going to see that the most likely conditions post-pandemic are very, very different. For many companies, the last 2 years have essentially been about demand fulfillment, not selling. I'm doing some work, I won't mention the company, it was in confidence, but they're a big company, you all recognize them. Among other things, they make glass. Fabulous last 2 years. Why? People are buying bigger TV sets. They're buying more computers, right? All that household spending has been a good thing for people that make glass. But post-pandemic, those people are going to actually have to sell. It won't be about demand fulfillment. It'll be about selling and delivering differentiated value versus competitors. Demand patterns will shift, and as a result, so will share of dollar. And basically, for a number of firms, whether you were hit hard or easy, again, the issue was survival, capacity utilization, take what price we can get. There will necessarily be more emphasis on profitability. Sales managers will need to manage. Think about the bottom line of this way, all right? Now, what is changing in sales and why? Let me go through a quick précis of the book that you'll get a copy of. Then, as I said, I'm going to stop questions, comments, disagreements. The most important thing about sales and selling, always, I want to emphasize this, always, the most important thing about sales and selling is the buyer, not the seller. Who buys, why, and how. And that is where digital technologies are having their most dramatic and biggest impact. Now, I'm going to get academic with you for a moment, but bear with me because I think it makes the point. For over 60 years, the way buying has been conceptualized, and as a result, the way sales is thought of, is in terms of what academics call a hierarchy of effects model. What do they mean by that jargon? They mean the following, that the job in sales is to help move the buyer, the prospect, through a series of linear stages, and they'll use different jargon, but the most common model is IEE, move that buyer from awareness to interest to desire to action, all right? That's why most of the talk about sales is always using metaphors like funnels and pipelines. Virtually every CRM software out there is based on this. You know, depending upon where the rep, you put something in to the CRM system, at what stage, it automatically weights the propensity to buy, all right? On the other hand, that is not the way buying works in most markets by the third decade of the 21st century. Buyers are now in most markets online and offline multiple times during their buying journeys. I'll give you a quick example, all right? As an example we can all relate to, and the interesting thing about this example is the data I'm going to cite has remained pretty much the same throughout the pandemic. Buying a car in the United States, right? The vast majority of cars in the United States are bought and still bought in brick and mortar dealers, over 95%, all right? Yet, if you look at J.D. Power's data, and it's very good data, the average car buyer in the United States now spends over 13 hours online researching the purchase. You probably have done this. I know I do. You go to Edmunds.com, Autotrader.com, gives you information about the wholesale price the dealer is paying, what's behind every option package, etc. Over 13 hours online doing research, and a total of about 3.5 hours going to various dealerships. But over 95% of the cars are bought in the dealer. Now, does this mean the internet doesn't matter? No. But what it does mean is not that the dealer is going away, but that the sales tasks in the dealership are now dramatically different because the prospect already shows up with comparative product and price information. And those of you old enough like me to have bought multiple cars in the US in the last 20 years, I think can attest, by and large, it's become a much more pleasant experience. Not because the dealers went to Bible school, right? But because of what the information revolution has done to the buyer. And that's happening in more and more and more markets. And it's a big deal. It changes the fundamentals of managing marketing and sales. More emphasis on value added of the salesperson in customer interactions. I want to phrase this as bluntly as I can. The days of a salesperson being basically a walking, talking version of direct mail and product literature are fast disappearing. The buyer doesn't need the rep for that. So the rep has to up their game. More emphasis on the value added. Dynamic buying means more cross-functional interactions in selling. Sales has always been an organizational outcome. It depends on product, on price, on a lot of things besides the skills and smarts of the rep. But it's increasingly cross-functional because, again, what technologies do is allow buyers to interact with more people in the selling organization. And, you know, you run businesses. I ran a business for 11 years. And the reality of silos in business is real. And the cost of that is increasing. Marketing and sales are undergoing a data revolution, and that has multiple impacts. I just want to focus very briefly on two. The reality, in my experience, through the case studies, consulting, the business I ran, sales in most organizations was a black box. The anecdote I'm about to relate to you, I've experienced 3 times on boards of directors, all right? The head of sales, call that person whatever you want, now we like to call them chief revenue officers. I guess that, somehow sounds better than VP of sales. I don't quite get why. But the head of sales makes a presentation to the board, then the board goes into executive session. For those of you who don't know, that's where people really talk, all right? And 3 times the discussion I've been a part of, basically what the other board members are saying is, well, I'm not sure he really understood the question. I'm not sure she understands how we accrete enterprise value in this business, but she makes their numbers every quarter. Let's leave them alone. Those days are fast disappearing because what the data revolution is doing is making sales increasingly transparent, especially to finance. Again, if you look, how many of you, when I use this phrase, know what I'm referring to? It's common in SaaS businesses, but getting more common in many others. Sales operations, sales ops. This is a fast-growing group in sales organizations. They're really the data gurus. They're the ones, who do the data analytics. 50% of these groups do not report to sales. They report up through data analytics that in turn reports to finance. And one of the things I'm sure you've noticed in your career, finance people are annoying. They are. Once they get data, they start to ask questions. And they go back to the head of sales and they say, well, yeah, how do you spend this enormous amount of money on a fully burdened basis that you're allocating? What is your cost to serve different accounts, segments? By the way, can you spell return on invested capital? My advice to those of you that are young, we got a number of young people here. If you want to make a career in sales, it's a different game. You better make sure that you've got a certain level of financial literacy that most salespeople historically did not have. That's the single most important thing I think would be my advice, single most important thing you can do to further your career. The other thing, and here I'm going to zoom out, it's a bit more macro. McKinsey, to give them credit, did a very good study about this a few years ago. But basically what you see going on globally is a big shift in productivity efforts in companies globally. As a general rule, what you see going on in most industries is a shift in productivity efforts from the back end of the value chain, supply chain management, operations, shared services, all the things you've been reading articles about in Harvard Business Review for the last 30 years. It turns out, when people focus on this, it makes a difference. They've done a good job there. The focus is now increasingly at the front end of the value chain. And again, you can call it whatever you want. I really don't care. But the front end of the value chain is where the go-to-market is. And the reason that shift is occurring is, it's the old story about the bank robber. When the bank robber is arrested and he's asked, well, why do you rob banks? He says, well, that's where the money is, isn't it? Right? That's increasingly where the costs are. And indeed, if you look at a lot of, up where I am in Boston, I'm sure you've got this area in Pittsburgh. If you sort of look at where the mini Silicon Valleys are in our area, it's near MIT. If you walk into the buildings there and look at the directories and then say, well, who are these companies? Easily 50% of them are in effect companies that are doing software about some form of sales benchmark, sales productivity, et cetera. And by the way, it's all HBS mafia. It is. I mean, they're all HBS folks. I mean, most of them are not going to succeed, but it's just going to accelerate what we see going on. Now, this makes a difference in core areas, people. Let me say a little bit about this. Hiring. There have always been inherent challenges in sales hiring that simply do not exist to the same extent in any other business function. For example, let me use higher education as an example. If you want to hire an engineer, you can go to a school, University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, whatever. You can go to a school and it's a little bit like walking into a food court. What are you interested in? You want electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, right? Civic engineering. If you want to hire someone for finance or accounting, you can find folks who majored in that subject. The same is true for computer programmers. But the last time I looked, which was about a little over 2 years ago when I started writing this book, of the nearly 5,000 colleges and universities in the United States, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program. In other words, this is a line of work where the vast majority of people start knowing almost nothing about what they're going to get paid for. It is classic learning by doing. That leads to the other data point you see here. Companies already spend and have long spent a ton of money on sales training. The data says they spend 20% more per capita on sales training than in any other business function, but obviously Sandler accepted. The ROI on sales training is notoriously disappointing, and there are systemic reasons for that. We can talk about that if you want. Process, as I've already mentioned, many sales models are simply based on obsolete assumptions about buying. And I think that the emerging analytics and the pandemic has revealed this. I think one of the things that the pandemic has revealed to many companies is that, in effect, they were overpaying for many tasks in their sales models. In other words, we don't need our most expensive enterprise reps doing lead generation. We can get that done with much less expensive people, or maybe even with an algorithm. We don't need all the meetings we've been doing. You can do a number of demos online, etc. I do think that is a new normal. I don't think that knowledge is going to go away. But the point is that a lot of processes in sales need rethinking to increase selling time. Again, a bit of data that may or may not surprise you. And admittedly, this is data that varies by industry. But in the aggregate, if you ask yourself, how much time does the average salesperson spend in customer contact? And by customer contact, I don't simply mean, making a pitch for a product either in person or virtually. I mean all forms of customer contact, email, webinars, etc. On average, that number is between 30 and 35%, right? Now think about the impact in your business if you can make that 40%, 45%, nirvana, 50% or more. Not only is that an enormous productivity gain in most businesses, but it also increases the addressable market of the business, right? Segments that were economically unfeasible to reach now become feasible with better sales utilization. Big deal, very, very big deal. Partners, it is an omni-channel buying world. That demands an omni-channel response, although I must tell you, I'm still occasionally surprised that, I either in boards or working with companies, still have to sit through these, what I consider these sterile academic meetings. Should we be online? Should we be in person? It's the third decade of the 21st century. The answer is yes, right? An omni-channel buying world demands a multi-channel response. It's not either or. Online and offline, this has been demonstrated again and again and again. Think about all the direct-to-consumer companies that have opened stores in the last 10 years and during the pandemic, for God's sakes. They're more often more often complements than they are substitutes. But multi-channel selling is a big deal in most sales forces, because what happens is that the individual contributor, and that's who most salespeople are, right? It's one of the reasons they went into sales. They value the autonomy. I make my numbers, they leave me alone. The individual contributor in a multi-channel go-to-market now has to get things done through others. Now, again, you talk to the leadership gurus. There's a half century of research about this. That is a tough transition in any function, but especially in sales. Pricing. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but you got a copy of this book. I do urge you all, read the 2 chapters on pricing. One of the things I learned when I left academia and ran a business is that most talk in business is just talk. You know, yada, 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 until you get to the topic of price. Then that's the moment of truth. You either get the price or you don't. A price is where you test the coherence of a value proposition and ultimately a strategy. But the reality is that the data analytics that are available are increasing the opportunities for value-based pricing. Most managers think it's the opposite because they think the world is Amazon, right? Amazon, Bezos, you may love him or loathe him, but this guy's sharp. I mean, he's not a nice person, but he's a sharp business person. He understands how to commoditize other businesses, right? Amazon has got that playbook, but Amazon is like 5% of sales. The reality is there are more value pricing opportunities out there, and equally important, more tools available for price testing, and tools that are much, much better than these silly surveys that most companies do about price. You know, how many people wake up in the morning and say, yeah, I want to spend higher price, right? I mean, you do a survey, I can tell you ex ante what you're going to hear. But now we have tools that can look at behavior. They click or they don't click. They buy or they don't buy in this medium. But there's surprisingly high inertia at firms. If you read the book, you'll see this quoted. How many of you know who David Ogilvy was? Anybody know who David Ogilvy was? The founder of Ogilvy and Mather, a real character. How many of you know the TV series Mad Men? All right. The John Hamm character is obviously based on Ogilvy. Ogilvy wrote a book in the mid-60s. That's a long time ago. It's a book, a wonderful book, by the way, called Confessions of an Advertising Man. And it's not like most business books. You know, most CEOs, I came, I saw, I conquered. Now, this is a wonderful book. And Ogilvy, at one point in his book, says, you know, most people feel that most companies, when they set price, are doing it through some kind of scientific method. But throughout my career, and at this point, Ogilvy was in his 60s, throughout my career, what I have found is that the process is basically guesswork. I'm now the age Ogilvy was when he wrote that book. And 50 years later, I would say the same thing, all right? But this is an area where there are more tools available. If you don't use them, shame on you. I mean, that's my basic message. And then a last point I want to make here, and then I'm going to stop for a bit. Productivity. We are in fundamentally a services economy. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, it's about 12% of the US labor force that works in sales. And that number is almost certainly hugely underestimated. Because in a services economy, most people who do business development for a living are not called salespeople for Labor Department reporting purposes. You know, they're called associates, managing directors. You know, think about banks. Everybody in a bank is a vice president, right? But business development is what they do for a living. You know, this is always my message to CEOs. Look, if you want to go to Davos and, you know, sound fancy, that's up to you. But if I were on your board, I'd ask you, why are you doing that? As opposed to talking to a customer. But in a service economy, increasing sales productivity is not only a profit maximizing activity, it's a social impact issue. Peter Drucker, you all remember Peter Drucker? Good. I mentioned Peter Drucker at MBAs last semester. It was like I said, remember Julius Caesar, right? Peter Drucker, smart guy, wrote an article in Harvard Business Review in 1992. That's 30 years ago. He used sales as his example. Drucker's point in the article is that services productivity lags, and that's a big issue for societies. And I'm basically quoting Drucker now. He said, if we don't get better at that, you are going to see political divisions, class warfare. This, think about our last few elections, think about any newspaper you open these days. Drucker was very, very prescient. So, again, you can talk about ESG or whatever you want, but I think that the way the world gets better is when business people make sure they first take out the garbage and clean up their own companies. Sales is a social issue. You're adding social value when you get better at this. But, and this is a bit of data that also surprises people, the C-suite is increasingly composed of specialists. I had a colleague at Harvard Business School. Her name's Julie Wolf. She no longer teaches there. I think she's out of Berkeley. Julie did a great study a few years ago. What she found is if you look at the global 1,200 biggest companies in the world, the number of people reporting to the CEO on average has doubled in those companies in the last 20 years, twice as many. But then if you ask yourself, well, who are these people? Where did they come from? What were they doing before they became senior executives? The reality is that very, very few of them were general managers in the sense in which we use that phrase in business schools. In business schools, when we talk about a GM, we typically mean somebody running a line of business or somebody with profit and loss responsibility. The vast majority of these people are specialists, right? The CIO, the CMO, the CFO. 25 years ago, people forget this, there were twice as many COOs in the global 1,200 as there were CFOs. Now the proportion has flipped. Now, why is this the case? It's not like companies wake up and say, wow, let's become siloed and bureaucratic. No, the world is more complex. There is an information revolution, right? Being a head of marketing today is vastly more complex than it was as recently as 10 to 15 years ago. But the reality is fewer people than ever before have made it to the C-suite with a background in sales and marketing. Heidrick and Struggles, for some reason, people in that business don't like this phrase. The headhunters, the executive recruiters, they have published for 25 years a wonderful study. It's called The Route to the Top. It looks at the backgrounds of people becoming CEOs. About 3 years ago, they stopped breaking out sales and marketing as a separate category because it was basically de minimis. About 55% of these people, their background is finance and engineering, then a variety of others, and then somewhere down there are people who've come up through the sales and marketing route. The reality, and don't let this happen to your company, this is an advantage small companies have when they're competing with the giants. The reality is that many, many senior executives in big companies do not know the questions to ask about their company's sales model. And that makes putting together strategy and executing strategy a lot more difficult. But that's the human resource reality in the C-suite of companies. All right, that took a bit longer than I thought, but let me stop there. Any questions, comments about anything that I've talked about? Singh?
Your last comment about CEOs not having sales and marketing. Some pros and cons. Why are 1,200 larger companies changing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
well,
what is the benefit or drawback of it?
Yeah.
And is it your opinion only, or the companies are experiencing better results by doing what they're doing?
Well, I mean, the results are going to be are going to vary by sector, but I think the reasons behind that are reasonably straightforward. Probably the single biggest reason is the capital markets, right? Again, by the way, Jerome Powell, head of the Federal Reserve, doesn't care what I think, doesn't care what you think. You can send him an email, he's not going to listen. But it's hard to imagine that the last now almost 15 years of negative interest rates are going to continue for the rest of this decade. But in that environment, finance, debt, et cetera, the things we associate with people with finance backgrounds have had an outsized impact on enterprise value. So that's one reason. The other reason, I think, is that sales and marketing, first marketing and now sales, have gotten increasingly specialized. One could argue ghettoized within the organization. And then the third reason, I think, is that for whatever reason, when boards of directors look at who the candidates are, the person who may be coming up through the customer-facing function doesn't look as attractive as someone else. Now, your other question, which I think is the right one, saying is, do I think this is a problem? And the answer is, yeah, I think it is. I think if you think you can run a business without ongoing existential knowledge of customers and prospects, good luck. There is such a thing as luck in business, but I think that's tough. And I sit on boards. VCs are a good example. These people, their background is fundamentally finance. They can be BS'd about their business development functions, and very often are. So I think it is a problem, a big problem. Yeah.
So what's the metric would you recommend looking at for sales?
That will vary. I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about performance. But at the end of the day, I come from the old school. I think profitability counts. If you've got what we used to call a sugar daddy, in other words, a VC or set of VC firms that are willing to just keep plowing money, you can do that. But at the end of the day, it's not only about top line motion. It has to be about enterprise value. And profitability correlates pretty damn highly with enterprise value. So that's where I would start. And then, let's understand how customer acquisition and retention works in the business. And I want to get back to what I said earlier. This is very, very context specific. Be wary of these huge generalizations. Yeah.
You mentioned a 30 to 35% customer contact. What is the gap? So you mentioned being at the nirvana of 50. Where do you see the gap, the opportunity of not irritating your existing customers?
Yeah.
Really,
yeah. It's a good question. And you're asking the question the right way, because usually when I get asked that question, the question is, well, if it's not 35%, what should it be? And here I would say what I just said to you. That depends, right? Depends on the sales model. Think about enterprise sales versus, inside sales, right? By the way, you know what best practice is now in inside sales? How many calls per hour an inside sales force makes? About 20. That's a call every 3 minutes, 8 hours a day, right? Some people literally go nuts there, and some people thrive. But your point is, where's the gap? Here's where I would begin to look. And again, you'll see a chapter about this. Look at the customer conversion dynamic in your business, all right? What is it that we do or need to do to move a prospect into a paying customer? What drives retention? And my experience is that in the majority of instances, expensive salespeople are being asked to do things in that customer conversion process that can be done more efficiently and cheaper by people in marketing, or when it comes to retention, by people in what we now call customer success, post-sale service, or by product, et cetera. And this is an area where technology is your friend, where the technology allows you to do these things more efficiently. That I think is the first place I'd look. And then the other place is the way we deploy our salespeople. This is what frontline sales managers typically have the most influence over. Are we deploying our salespeople where they make a difference, as opposed to some other activity in the organization? You'll see an example in the book, Microsoft. You know, the guy running Microsoft the last 7 years has done a lot of good things. I mean, he's a CEO who I think deserves whatever he's getting paid. But one of the things he did was reassign or redesign the way Microsoft assigns accounts. It made a big difference to their profitability and the amount of customer contact time that their reps have. So that's where I'd begin. What are we asking sales to do that some other group in the company can just do more efficiently, or even a machine can do? Yeah.
How has relationship selling changed? And is it still true that people buy people they trust?
My short answer to both questions is, well, the first question is about how's it changed. Yeah, people buy from people they trust. This, by the way, in my opinion, is the fallacy at the heart of much of what you hear about online this and online that. Shopping, buying has always been, for millennia, a social as well as an economic transaction. And I don't think a once-in-a-century pandemic fundamentally changes that. So yes, trust remains important. But again, how is that changing? I get back to my car example, which I think is illustrative of a lot of other areas. The way you build trust changes now in many areas, because it's not about product information or whatever. That's increasingly available. It's other things that people do. Now, our jargon for that in sales has long been solutions selling, right? I mean, I think we'd all agree with that. Not many customers say, I want to buy problems. They want to buy solutions. But that's increasingly important. You know, Harvard Business Review ran an article about 10 years. I think it's still one of their best-selling articles, The End of Solution Selling. I don't know if you know that article. It was basically, what's the name of those people? They sold to Gartner for this outrageous amount of money, the Challenger sale, right? I think that article, I'm going to use a technical phrase, that article got it completely bass-ackwards. When you look at the data, what we call solution selling, the ability to link your product or service to a business outcome, has increased in importance, not decreased. And that's where I think relationships coagulate around. Yeah. Depending on the strategy and the business model, there are still direct-to-consumer companies where, you know, I'm on the board of one where, you know, guess what? That's a lot more than 18%. My point there, the number, the point of that number is that this is not a digital leads physical world. That's just a fallacy.
And so then in the slide that you had, a lot of complexity there. There's a lot of investment when you play in that
Yep.
game seriously, right? So there's a disconnect, in my opinion, about if you're a B2B business, small of your revenue on digital selling, right? Or being on that where you're already looking. Is that enough, right? Is 15%
Yeah.
enough based on the fact that it's always changing?
Yeah. The answer is, I don't know if 15% is enough. Neither do you. right? That's why you're asking the question. But I'd say a few things about this. One is, again, this is an increasingly expensive medium, and the pandemic has made it dramatically more expensive. You know, CAC, what we now call CAC, cost of acquiring a customer. CAC through digital marketing means the graph looks like this, which is why you got people who try to BS you with something called EBITDA, right? I mean, that's what's behind that, because, you know, when we open their books, you know, this is what we see. So I don't know if it should be 15% or 50%, but that form of go-to-market should be held to the same criteria that we hold others. Is it helping us with profitable sales? Now, what makes it complex is that it is an omni-channel buying world. With B2B, as a general rule, what you'll find, you know, the actual volume of e-commerce in B2B is more than it is in consumer markets. The volume is, but not the percentage of sales. And even when you look at what e-commerce is in B2B, it tends to be for a lot of maintenance items, the rebuy, et cetera. So, you know, should it be 15%? I don't know, but you've got to be doing a chunk of both. But you've got to be testing this, because one of these areas is increasing in expense a lot faster than the other. And you know what I don't think is a good thing, and I think this is the political reality in a lot of companies. One of the things that that motivates companies to spend a lot of money on digital is, at least in the last decade, it's sort of become a badge of innovation, right? And we're not some old fart that's going to be disrupted. We're doing, quote, I love this phrase, digital transformation, right? You understand what that means? I don't, and I'm not stupid, right? All right. So I think that stuff of what a good board of directors should do, what a good CEO should do, is make sure people know what they're talking about when they talk about something that allocates people time or money. So that's where I begin. I don't know what the data is, but I'm pretty sure salespeople are not disappearing. They've increased in numbers throughout the 21st century, even as the internet has gotten bigger. And to the question that was asked earlier, people do business with people. And, you know, absent an invasion from Mars, that's going to continue. Any other questions? Yes.
So a quick question. My name is Frank as well. So I'm with a large consulting firm, and we're backed by VCs. And the holding companies are acquiring all these consulting firms. Right?
Yep.
And as we're growing and scaling, we have marketing doing marketing. We've got senior sales executives doing senior sales executive work. And then we've got business development, doing business development, demand gen. How do you define business development in that type of scenario?
In professional services.
In professional services, like where do you
Yeah.
see that are being important tasks?
Yeah. I can speak there from experience, and you know, again, take this for what it's worth, Frank, because you know, as they say in the gangster movies, you chose this life, right? You are the two best decisions I ever made in business was saying no to investors that were doing a roll-up in our sector of professional services. So that's comment number one. It's tough to merge professional services firms. They develop their own culture, their own ways of doing things, and they tend to be what I call above average IQ people. And the problem with smart people is they can rationalize anything. You know, dummies, they shut up. Smart people, no, this is the way we got to do it. So that's the first and most important issue. It has nothing to do with sales or business development per se, but keep your eye on that. It's hard. The second comment is this: as a general rule in professional services, and this is what, if you take, these courses in leading professional services firms, you'll come across this jargon because it does point to a real behavioral reality. But as a general rule, there's who the customer wants to talk to when it comes to will I buy or won't I buy is not some professional business development person. They want to talk to the person who's going to do the job, that sort of thing. So business development, and here I can't speak with a lot of experience for what it's worth. Business development in professional services firms, you'll find that that function has only intermittent success. It works in some places, but it doesn't work in most others. Because at the end of the day, people want to deal with the people who are actually going to do the work. In other words, you, the consultant, are the product. That's the nature of professional services. So, that would be my, my second comment. But then the third comment, there is a role there for marketing and so-called content marketing. That I do think is a very, very important activity in any professional services firm. So you owe me an email a year from now, all right? Frank to Frank. Is this working out? What's been your biggest surprise positively, your biggest surprise negatively? Fair enough?
Oh, yeah, rolling out business development across the entire corporation is something that's fallen. So it's has its own.
Yeah.
We do marketing work, we do demand gen inside sales work, and then we have to manage over how we roll that out across the different groups. So it's challenging.
Yeah, no, and it will continue to be challenging, but don't commit what they call the sunk cost fallacy. That's something that's endemic in initiatives like that. Any other? Yes. Yeah.
Feel if there's a short-term solution that's a better segmentation, because the customer you're going after is testing different avenues, because we do see that, especially with that.
Yeah.
About the same, the overall use, returning use.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the company up in my neck of the woods, I don't quite understand why they're valued as much as they do, but Wayfair, right? I mean, Wayfair's built its entire business that way. So I think among other things, they've demonstrated that, digital, somewhat counterintuitively to most people in the industry, digital can work in a category where people assume, well, I'm not going to buy the sofa until I bounce up and down on it, right? So that's comment number one. There's a role there. Comment number two, and again, this is a generalization. But if you look at the tools that are available for doing this, from Facebook, from Google, from others, a good article about this that was published last month, those tools are actually pretty darn good at targeting segments. If you know who your segment is, they're pretty good at allowing you to target much more precisely than what was available as recently as 5, 6, 7 years ago. But moving that target through the conversion dynamic, that's a different story. And that's much harder to measure. And that's where I think, if I were you, I'd be putting a lot of the creativity, innovations. The good news about that area is that you can do lots of relatively inexpensive tests. What works, what doesn't. But the targeting part, I think you can feel confident about. Whether it results in a sale once we target, that's a much, much more complex issue. All right, let me continue for a bit. And again, questions at any point. The point that I've been making, marketing and sales requirements are changing, all right? And it's not going away, they're changing. And by the way, let me also make another generalization because it's relevant to the last two questions. As a general rule, what I see going on is that in terms of budget, in terms of, I don't know any other way to phrase it, power within companies, sales is increasing in those areas, marketing is not. I'd much rather be in sales than marketing these days. SaaS businesses are a good example. If you look at the way SaaS businesses do their customer acquisition, inbound marketing, and then, some inexpensive junior person, and then the account executive, what I call adult supervision, finally gets it. What they do in content marketing a decade ago would clearly have been in marketing's domain. Now it's done by sales. And the question is, do the salespeople know what they're doing? I mean, that's really the question as they increasingly take over marketing activities. But sales and marketing is an area in business where change is always difficult, always, for systemic reasons, not because people just say, I don't want to change. Everybody has that inertia built in, but it's especially difficult here. The reality in most businesses is that so many other organizational plans and resource allocations depend on sales forecasts and the sales force's ability to actually meet those forecasts, right? That's why, we get books like Predictable Revenue, The Science of Selling. Hey, when I use the word science, I mean if we do X, Y, Z, that man or woman can go to the moon and come back alive. That's not business. Business is not, never will be a science in that sense, all right? But the point, because of that central role of sales forecasts and sales ability, sales and marketing are therefore under pressure always to make the numbers. The metrics that are used there, to your question, usually reinforce current business development activities. There's a reason most sales managers think short term. Always remember one of the first case studies that I wrote at Harvard. This goes back years. And you got to remember, at the time, I'm recently out of graduate school. I probably smell like an academic at that point in my career. And I'm asking this senior executive questions, and he can size me up immediately, I now realize. And he looks at me and says, Frank, let me tell you something. In my line of work, if you don't survive the short term, you don't have to worry about the long term, right? That's the role of sales and marketing in most companies. But the common result here is to avoid the transition costs. Stick with the devil despite changes in buying criteria. That's how companies get disrupted. This is a slide I've been using with groups for about 20 plus years, 44 ways of doing nothing. When I was younger and naive, this is like before the days of PowerPoint, I'd use a slide like this and, a couple of people would come up to me afterwards and say, Frank, that slide you used about 44 ways, could I have a copy? And when I was younger, I thought, wow, I'm having an impact. And then over time, I realized why they were asking me for the slide. There were a few things here they hadn't thought about, 30, that's a good one. I'm going to use that one with my boss. But that's the reality in this area. But, this is what leaders work on. Leaders are about productive change. And the way I think about this area of business is that change first and foremost requires direction. If you're going to ask me to go on the long march, I'd like to know that there's a map, a strategy. All right, I want to talk a little bit about that. But then desire, increasing the sense of opportunity. This is why we're doing this. And then where most of organizational life gets spent, in process, motivating and engaging people, working across boundaries. I'm going to spend some time talking about this first part, direction, identifying the priorities. And my advice to all of you is that, at least when it comes to sales, start with people, all right? Not the data, not the digital, start with people. And in particular, 3 crucial areas: hiring, getting better results from whatever training you do, and then performance management and productivity processes. So let me say a few words about each of these. I'll give you some data to think about, a point of view. I'll stop after each. Any questions, comments? Again, hiring. This is a crucial decision. You know, one of the oldest aphorisms in business when people complain, hey, you hired your problems, right? I want to emphasize that because this is a big issue in the current labor market. How many of you have jobs that you simply can't find people for? Can I see a show of hands about that? Yeah, I see that again and again. Let me tell you, and again, I ran a business for 11 years. Trust me, it's much nicer being an academic. You got a real job and you can keep it, all right? So I understand that what I'm saying is easy to say, hard to do. But I see a lot of businesses right now basically hiring anyone who's got a pulse. You're going to pay for that down the road. This aphorism remains true. You hire your problems. I don't think the current labor market should be seen as an excuse to forget criteria, all right? This is also something that is not only getting harder because of the pandemic, but this was getting harder before the pandemic. The time to fill open positions and so-called ramp-up time, in other words, the time it takes for a new hire in sales to get up to full productivity, those metrics have steadily increased according to the surveys and research for the last 10 to 12 years, even before the pandemic. The point is that each sales hire in many companies is a bigger sunk cost. And this is an area of business where individual performance is very, very wide, much more wider than in almost any other business function. The top 15% of reps in most sales forces, this is research that has been done numerous times, always shows the same thing. The top 15% of reps in most sales forces are usually not just a little bit better than the average rep. They're very often orders of magnitude more productive than the average rep. The 80-20 rule, you all familiar with that? And when you got a PhD, you don't say 80-20, you say Pareto optimality. That's how you get your fees up, right? Sounds better. The 80-20 rule is not simply true in customer bases, it's true in sales forces. This is one of my favorite set of studies. Again, one of the reasons business is not a science, there are very, very few opportunities in business to do anything close to what you and I would call a controlled test. When you're doing research in business, you got to think about basically, repairing the sails of the boat while it's in full sail on the open seas in weather that you do not control. That's a lot different than doing a clinical trial or statistically significant tests for an academic journal. But the closest to a controlled experiment are these studies that are done in retail. People selling the same product at the same counter. The results typically vary by 300 to 400%. The point is that this is an area, sales, where talent matters, right? It's a creative activity. You will see results like this in most creative occupations, Broadway and movies. It's a very, very skewed distribution of results. VCs, right? The reality in the aggregate, venture capital is a horrendous investment. Only the top 20% of VC firms actually generate good returns for their limited partners. And within that top 20%, It's very often 1, 2, 3 companies in the portfolio. So this is true in most creative activities, including sales. There are such things as sales stars in most firms, but stardom is not easily portable across firms. I have a colleague, his name, I don't know if you ever took a course with him, Boris Groisberg, great HR person, somebody you may want to invite to the Institute. But Boris did a study a few years ago, it was published in a book called Chasing Stars, where he documents this, the difficulty of portability of talent. And the reason, and this is even more true in sales, the reason is that so much of productivity and success in a company depends not only on your skills and capabilities, but the other people and processes that you work with. And sales is a classic example. It's not a coincidence that most salespeople, are sort of nice to the folks in manufacturing and service in their business. Now, I know you got to treat everybody equally, but here's a box of chocolates. Treat me a little more equal than the others, right? That's just the way it works. So much of sales success depends on internal as well as external relationships. And the data revolution is making a difference in what it is you need in sales. Again, I don't know how well you can read this, but if you've got the book, you'll see it in the book. This is research I did with some others a few years ago. What we did, we had this good software to do it. We looked at job profiles posted on LinkedIn and other places in the first decade of this century. And then when we did the research, 2010 to 2015. And when you looked at the first decade, these were the competencies people were looking for in sales. Someone who can develop leads. Do they work hard? Commits time and effort to ensure success. By the way, this remains very, very important. Don't kid yourself. Persistence counts in sales. How many of you compete with Chinese companies? They are good case studies for persistence. It makes a difference, all right? But these were the top competencies. Then if you looked less than a decade later, what were the job profiles putting at the top? Prioritizes tasks through logical analysis. Embraces strategic vision. In other words, the issue of enterprise value and profitability that I keep coming back to. Now, does this mean that we no longer care about lead generation and persistence in hiring salespeople? No. The way to interpret this data, and this is what you should expect in any competitive activity where advantage is always relative advantage, the way to interpret this data is in line with the old joke. You know the old joke about the two men that are out hunting, and one of them, by mistake, fires his gun, wounds a bear. The bear starts chasing them. And one guy says, I don't know why we're doing this. We're not going to outrun this bear. And the other guy says, well, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you, right? That's what you should expect in any competitive activity. These are now what get you to the table. These are the differentiators. And I would argue if we did this study again, you'd find yet other stuff there that, again, builds on what we expect. The bar is rising in sales. I mean, that's what the data says. Meanwhile, however, most hiring in sales still views talent like this. I've been hearing this my entire career, and I still do. Why'd you hire X? Well, X is a good hunter, or Y is a good farmer. The reality is most sales roles are much more nuanced than this simple view. And my experience here, and again, once upon a time, I looked like Jimi Hendrix. I've got a fair amount of experience with this. The vast majority of sales managers, when they use this jargon, are not really using it to hire people. They're using it to justify what they already did, right? They're not really ex ante criteria. They're ex post rationalization of the choices. So-and-so is a hunter, so-and-so is a farmer. But hiring is about hiring in anticipation of performance, not rationalizing that performance. And again, a very, very context-specific area. Now, what I think, and again, I'd urge you to borrow Sean's analogy. This is, if you're going to turn the script into a movie, this is a good place to start. Getting more rigorous about sales, hiring practices. Start with the relevant buying journey and the important marketing and sales tasks in your business, and not with these context-free abstractions about sales personalities. The research in this area is over 100 years old, and it's pretty darn definitive at this point. There is no one thing as a sales personality, all right? Talent comes in all shapes and sizes in this area of business. So, shake off these generalizations, but also understand the inherent limitations of interviewing in this area of business. Managers, especially busy sales managers, that need to fill a position, vastly overrate their ability to predict performance and fit based on interviews, right? What the data and research indicates here is about a 20 to 40% correlation between the evaluations people get in their interviews and their subsequent actual job performance. In other words, even in the best of circumstances, it is less than the 50-50 rate of flipping a coin. And by the way, Frank, the 20% figure is about professional services because it is so clear. Here's the best way I know how to make this point, because I make this point, and what I notice with executives, they go through sort of like the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. What are you talking about? How many of you have kids? Can I see a show of hands? How many of you, your children are less than 18 years old? All right. Let me tell you what the reality is. Right now, your kids that are less than 18, most of them, don't know what you do for a living and don't care, all right? Your basic role is to be a caring, nurturing ATM. And that's just the way it works, all right? But at some point, they're going to get older. They're going to go to school. They're going to look for a job. And what's going to happen? You watch. They're going to have an interview scheduled with a company that they really want to work for. And they're suddenly going to look at you and say, Mom, Dad, you've been in business for years. I'll bet you've hired people. And you'll say, yes, son, daughter, I have. Well, hey, give me some advice. What do I got to do to ace this interview? Now, I'm assuming you want that kid to succeed, right? Your interests are aligned. What advice would you give that person? This is your child. What advice would you give them? Yeah, it's the 21st century, right? Go to LinkedIn, go to their website, find out what you can about the company, the people who are going to interview you. What other advice? Do your homework. I mean, I think that's right. Yep. Yeah. And probably listen when you're in the interview as well. All right. Anything else? Be authentic, right? Hey, I've known you for 18 years. You're not that good an actor or actress. Let me tell you what the research says, because you got to prioritize these things. All these things are relevant, but what the research says is the most important advice you can give to that young person is, look, when you go into that interview, when the door opens, make sure you stand up straight, your posture is good. Try your best to make eye contact with whoever is in the room. And when you shake their hand, shake their hand firmly. Why? The importance of first impressions. What the research indicates again and again and again is that those first impressions not only become very important, but that the interviewer then processes information about that person in line with that first impression. Boy, they really did their due diligence. Hey, they listened when I talked, right? Now, what, however, does that first impression tell us about the candidate? Answer, very, very little, 20 to 40% correlation. And there are lots of other reasons. Again, when I show this data to most executives, I don't know any other way to phrase it. They tend to get pissed off. Hey, this is the data. If you don't believe me, there are 2 excellent review articles. Admittedly, they're academic. Have a cup of coffee when you read these articles, but they'll show you what over 50 years of research indicates about interviews and hiring.
So one of your points earlier was that stardom is not portable, right? But most companies who hire always look for how successful they want to hire their competitors.
That's right.
Right? But if you don't have the right processes, right, they're not going to ever be as
Yep.
successful at your company as they were
Yep.
at that company, if you can even get them,
Yep.
right? So is that a good?
I agree more than 100% actually with what you're saying. And I think you're pointing to the right activity. I mean, how many of you, my experience is most managers pretty early in their career have this experience. We hired so-and-so who was a star there, and somehow when they got to our firm, she didn't perform the way they performed there. Now, step back and think about that. It's not like those people suddenly got stupid, right? It's not like they suddenly lost their individual capabilities, but this is where my colleague Groisberg, I think, has it right. So much of stardom is situation company specific. And if you are going to hire those people, you've got it exactly right. Part of what leadership's responsibility is to accelerate that process of developing their relationships here, what we typically call onboarding. And there's a more general point that I'd add. This is my more than 100%. And when I say this, you're all going to nod because it sounds so damn obvious. And then most of you are going to forget it less than an hour after this session is over. There is no such thing in business as performance in the abstract. That Platonic ideal does not exist in business. There's only performance with our product, in our market, at our prices. That's what they've got to learn, because when they leave Company X, they leave all of that behind. They have to recreate it. And for some reason, many managers, especially sales managers, I think adopt this perverse attitude of, well, I'm gonna put them through a test. They have to show me. Wait a second. I'm the professor. You're not the professor. Your job is not to conduct tests. Your job is productivity. Your job is to get the most out of the people. So I think you got it exactly right. Yeah.
Just wanted to make a comment about, my thought on sales success and that parallel to that showing up for the interview. And I think a lot of people miss, they show up for the interview one way, and then that gets dwindled
That's
down
right.
over time. Where, I preach to our organization, you need to show up like that every day. Show up ready to win with that interview mentality. That
Yeah.
customer is the next interview.
Yeah.
In that sales
Yeah.
process. They're judging us based on that.
Yeah.
To maintain that level, because everybody shows up day one at the interview, acting, hoping, looking their best, but then they let that dwindle down.
Yeah. And you're not hiring.
Like,
Yeah.
keep that level of performance.
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, and the lesson, I think, is you're not hiring the interview version of the person. You're hiring that sustained performance. I mean, I'll give an example. This is after you graduate. I started this course, Entrepreneurial Sales and Marketing. And in one of the sessions of the course with the MBAs, we do a sales hiring exercise. But it's not purely theoretical. They have to hire, they've got to interview for 2 positions. One is an inside sales position at a company we've already discussed a case about, and the other is a field enterprise position at another company we've already discussed a case about. And I actually bring in people from the area for them to interview, sales people, all right? Then we debrief. the first thing I always hear from the MBAs, and again, IQ is not the scarce resource with our students. EQ may be a different story, but not IQ. The first thing I always hear every time I do this with the MBAs is, wow, people who sell for a living are really good at being interviewed. No kidding, who knew? But it's probably the single most important thing they learn in the course. So I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. Yep.
So you put up a slide with the hunters versus farmers. And with all of the disc trainer, you pick your personality modeling.
Yep.
You're going to use. What are your thoughts on using that as a basis before you even bring it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It like gives you more practice than just hunter and farmer.
Yeah.
Because a good salesperson has both of those.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's too blunt an instrument for the majority of sales roles. But you're raising a good issue. And again, you know, Bob was generous enough to order these books. You got the book. What the hell? Read some of it. But there is a chapter about exactly this. Let me tell you what I think is the good news and bad news about the assessments. If you go back to this research and you think there's not bias in hiring, you're kidding yourselves, all right? That bias exists. So to the extent that we use similar criteria through an assessment, that's probably a good thing, all right? But here's the issues. Most of the assessments that are used, especially in sales hiring, were never designed for hiring. DISC is a good example. Myers-Briggs is a good example. So the first thing is use the tool for the right job. Don't use a hammer when we need a screwdriver, that sort of thing. The second thing is tools are only as good as the people who are using the tools. How many sales managers are trained in the assessment, how to interpret the assessment that they're using? So much of what goes on with assessments, and they're being increasingly adopted precisely because they don't want to incur some bias or discrimination suit. But most of what goes on is what I call assessment theater. In other words, we use the assessment to justify my gut instinct. So we're right back to where we are in the research. But I think it's certainly better than what goes on in most interviews. You know, smells like a good person to me. I mean, that's what the research says. All right, let me give you some advice in addition about how to get better. The first is acknowledge these limitations. Again, when I go through this research with executives, I know what's going through some of your minds, which is, you know, that may be true of most people, but not me. I'm a hoarse whisperer. I can see into the interviewee's soul. What the research says is that's probably unlikely. So acknowledge those limitations. Don't get rid of interviews. I have colleagues that are very familiar with this research, and their basic advice to managers is, therefore, don't interview. In my opinion, only someone who's never run a business can say that seriously. Of course you interview. People hire people. People have to work with people, but you complement interviews with role plays and task-specific assignments. This is this gentleman's point. In sales in particular, it's about behavior. It's not about dress for success, etc. What can you do to get a view of behavior? One of the things you can do, job trials, tests, internship hiring scenarios. Now, when I say this to executives in the current environment, what I typically hear is, oh, come on, that's impractical. There's a war for talent out there. I can't hire on a kind of trial internship basis. And my response is, yes, you can, and that's what you're doing now. I mean, I don't care what you tell me in a hotel room at 9:30 in the morning in a seminar. I know what you're going to do 6, 9, 12 months from now if you hire someone in sales and that person is not working out. You're going to fire them. So why don't we upfront about this? And by the way, you can put together compensation packages that give you a hiring advantage on that basis. So don't read that out of court. Always get multiple opinions and perspectives in sales in particular. HR usually knows a hell of a lot more than most sales managers about interviewing and about assessments, but the relationship in most companies between sales and HR is fraught. HR people, in my experience, tend to be afraid of salespeople. They are. And salespeople, and one of the reasons is salespeople don't necessarily always treat them with the respect they deserve. But that's a partnership that's usually underutilized. And then, as I said earlier, the role of deployment, this was your question about how do we get to more than 30 to 35%. The role of deployment in focusing on key tasks and as a result, broadening the hiring pool. This is a lesson to learn from the inside sales models, right? Why can those models work with 20, 21, 22-year-olds who fundamentally don't know squat? Because they're not asking them to do the things that many of you are asking your salespeople to do. They're focusing them on tasks that a reasonably bright young person can master in 2, 3, 4 months. The other bit of advice I'd give you is clarify what the people doing the hiring mean by experience, because as was asked earlier, that is by far the most common criterion that's used. And the reason it's used is because of what I think is a false choice. Many people in sales in particular think that if I hire someone with lots of experience, then I don't have to spend money on training and development. Again, if you get back to the basic facts here, how context specific this activity is, you're going to spend that money anyway. So that's a false choice. But make sure that when people say we hire for experience, they know what they're talking about. There's a very slippery variable. Do we mean experience with a customer group? Healthcare is an example of this. Healthcare is what? 20% of our GDP? It's everything from medical devices to software to swabs. But the majority of those goods and services flow through hospitals. So somebody with experience with hospital buying processes, a rep who knows how to navigate a hospital, that person is more portable across healthcare product categories than in most other industries. But healthcare in this respect is the exception, not the rule. Is it experience with a customer group? Is it experience with the technology? One of the ways they're going to build trust is to know a lot about the product. In which case, do we have an internal hiring pool? Is it experience with the geography or buying culture? If I'm going to sell it to this ethnic group, guess who I want as a salesperson? Or is it simply experience with a certain kind of selling environment? You know, the data I mentioned earlier about inside sales. If you're making a call aided by the software every 2 to 3 minutes, how many people can deal with that relentless pace and how many cannot? It tells you something. But the key lesson here is clarify what one means by experience. Training and development. Anything else about hiring? Then I want to say a few words about this. As I've already mentioned, US companies already spend more on sales training than they do in any other function. And one of the reasons they do, and this data, with the exception of the current environment, has remained remarkably consistent for about 30 years. Turnover in sales in the aggregate averages between 20 and 30% annually. It's higher when economic conditions are good because people with talent and a track record have more options. And it's obviously lower when economic conditions aren't good. Think about 2020, right? A lot of people stayed with your company because, you call them loyal, they may call themselves hostages. They didn't have many choices. That's the way it's always worked. But what this means is that the equivalent of the entire sales force must be hired, trained, onboarded every 3 to 5 years in most firms. That's a big deal. And in fact, in my experience, if you total up in many companies, especially SMBs, the amount of money they spend on a fully burdened basis on hiring, training, annual sales comp, that number often exceeds the number of their largest CapEx expenditure. But that activity in sales rarely gets the same rigorous attention that CapEx expenditures get. Again, I wrote a case years ago, someone said to me something that I found is true. He said, you watch, a lot of companies actually spend a lot more time and attention about how they purchase software and office supplies than how they hire people. All right, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And again, the nature of sales tasks makes company-specific training onboarding a key driver. Now, what's the problem with many current sales training practices? There are a couple of systemic issues here. Most sales training is episodic, meaning the way it works is reps get bombarded, and that's the right word. They get bombarded with information at a given point in time. Very often when we're introducing a new product or when we have an initiative, right? Now we're gonna do business development. And what the learning and development people call the forgetting curve is very steep. Now, again, I don't want you to broadcast this because we make a lot of money with executive education at Harvard Business School. But what the data says is that the majority of salespeople forget 80+% of what they learn in a training seminar in less than 3 months. 80+%. That's a good example of quarterly short-termism. And the other reason that this becomes a problem, in order to amortize costs, the way training and development works in many companies, and you watch this as you go through the M&A, well, if we're going to get these people together, if we're going to do the training, we've got to amortize the costs. And since they do different tasks, they're selling different services, let's take a lowest common denominator approach, right? Problem. There is, by and large, a significant over-reliance on classroom training. That's what the data tells us. And ultimately, again, this is a behavioral activity. Talking about selling is not the same as selling. And in many companies, too much focus on a given sales methodology. Now, methodologies are very useful in sales. Among other things, if you're going to scale a business, it helps to have this. But again, if you think about the way sales works in this omni-channel buying world, what people call adaptive selling is increasingly important. And again, I don't want to offend anyone, but when you're running a sales training firm, you've got an incentive to say our methodology works here, France, Venus, Neptune, etc. Caveat emptor. It's up to you to do that due diligence. How do you get more from your training spending? The first important thing is to make sure you got a process that links hiring, onboarding, and training. Now, this is not politically correct to say in the current environment, but the reality is that all students are not above average. It is tough. It's just tough to train and develop someone who is a poor fit for that job in the first place. So hiring is at least as important to training ROI as the training method itself. The other thing that's important to recognize here is that the effects of talent, recruitment, and sales are cumulative. Again, the research about this is pretty definitive. Most salespeople learn the most, not from a trainer, certainly not from a professor. They learn from their peers. They watch the best of their peers perform the tasks. And they say, you know, the way you framed price, that was clever. I hadn't thought of that. The way you dealt with that objection, that's what I'm going to do. What's the implication, the managerial implication? Put in place processes, forums, et cetera, to accelerate that best practice. Identify the skills that matter most today, not yesterday. Focus training on where the rep makes a difference, again, versus marketing, product, whatever. And then understand adult learning and how salespeople develop. It's very task-oriented. It's very just in time. Salespeople are not studying for the final exam in my course, right? They pay attention to information when and where they need it. When is that? On their way to make a call or during the actual sales conversation itself. And this is an area where new sales enablement technologies are and should be your friend. Sandler, I think, I know from Dave Mattson, Sandler does a good job with this. There are more and more technologies that give reps access to that information when they're actually going to pay attention to it. And it accelerates best practices, peer learning. And yet right now, there's a lot of inertia around this, a lot of, the investing in let's have the big conference, as opposed to things that the research indicates can make a bigger difference. Let me stop there. Anything about training and development, then I'm going to wrap up with my last topic. Yes.
What's your advice for how to maximize the effectiveness? When you get your sales people together, how do you harness the power of these peer learning opportunities on
Yeah.
any best practices?
Now, by sales meeting, do you mean what I would call the big extravaganza, the kind of thing I get invited to speak to, or I got 6 salespeople, we're having a meeting?
Yeah, I'm thinking more the latter of the weekly
Yeah.
cadence or
Yeah.
maybe the monthly cadence, whatever's applicable.
Yeah, couple of things. I was saying this over dinner last night, I get these calls all the time. Oh, God, how do we get better at virtual selling? Same is true here. Most important thing is know how to run a meeting, which is a trainable skill. How many people have you met in business that know how to run a meeting, right? So that's the first thing. We got an agenda, all the basics. That's number one. Number two is, I think in sales in particular, the way I phrase this, markets in the history of business since the Phoenicians, a market or a market segment has never bought anything. Only individual customers buy. So if our meetings are not talking about accounts, about customers, about buying, what are we talking about? That will be comment number 2. And then comment number 3, the reality of rejection in sales is real. So sales meetings are also, about coming in from the cold and getting some chocolate, cookies, and loving care. In other words, there is a motivational aspect to this as well. But those would be my my top 3. All right. But at the end of the day, and this will be relevant to what I talk about with performance management, there's got to be some kind of account review that I think is what makes most sales meetings productive. Anything else about this topic? All right, let me go on to this last topic, and then I'll stop again. My experience with sales, and I'm amazed that this topic hasn't arisen this morning, because it's usually every other question, so good for you. Questions about sales compensation, all right? Now, again, I have colleagues who will tell you that the way people are paid doesn't matter, that it's about intrinsic rewards, purpose, passion, the current words. All I can say is that's not the planet I've lived on for 50 plus years, all right? Money matters. But if you look at the research, good coaching and performance reviews have an even bigger impact on results in sales. Your question about sales meetings is allied to this. Yet performance reviews, in my experience, are probably the most underutilized lever for affecting behavior in most organizations. People don't like to do it. They're not trained in doing it. Every year, like clockwork, you're going to find some article in Harvard Business Review that says, get rid of performance reviews. I think those articles are deeply, deeply misguided, very deeply misguided. Reviews also ultimately rely on the metrics you use. Most firms simply focus on sales volume. This is the most important thing, in my opinion, to understand about sales compensation. I'm going to use the jargon they used to use at IBM. At IBM, when somebody maxed out on their incentive, the incentive version of their sales compensation, the phrase they would use at IBM is that he or she, quote, hit big casino. That was their phrase, big casino. So if you were ever invited to speak at an IBM President's Club, you'd find people walking around and they point to others, hey, she's big casino. He's big, at first I didn't know what they meant. I thought it was like a Martin Scorsese film or something, but it means they maxed out on that. Now, if you look at sales comp plans, and it's about 70%, if you ask yourself, how do I hit big casino in most sales comp plans? The answer is very simple. Top line volume. That's it. Just top line volume, max top line volume, not the profitability of that sale, not the cost to serve that account, simply top line volume. You understand the message to the sales force in a sales comp plan like that. The message is there is no such thing as a bad customer, right? Simply no such thing. Bring them in, let someone else in the firm worry about it. So this is tied to evaluation metrics. But ultimately, what an effective review needs to do is linked to behaviors that can be coached. And I want to emphasize that because I think what I'm about to say is not just snide or a gross exaggeration, but most sales performance reviews are basically sermons. You know what you need to do? You need to get better and sell more. Geez, I hadn't thought about that. Get better, sell more, right? The really useful ones are about behaviors, about stuff that people can do. And let me give you an example, all right? Let's think about a classic inbound sales model that's by far the fastest growing sales model in the world in the last decade. Prospecting. As I said earlier, persistence counts. There's a very, very high correlation in most sales forces between the number of calls that a rep makes and their actual results, right? So make sure they work hard. It's about working smart as well, but it's certainly about working hard. What are the common causes of the rep who's simply not making the same numbers in prospecting? Usually they're overinvesting in unqualified opportunities, right? Opportunities that the Lord himself couldn't close. That's a training issue. Or time management issues. Or there's a lack of cadence or process. This is where methodologies can help a lot. On the other hand, within the same sales force, there's the person who is the Energizer bunny. The issue is not prospecting, but he or she is not moving them in that conversion dynamic to whatever is the next stage. A demo, a trial, contact. Are they not doing their so-called discovery interviews with sufficient depth? Again, a trainable issue. Or is it their prospecting criteria, or for some reason they don't build sufficient trust, to the question you asked earlier, when they do connect with customers. And then the third issue, and every sales force in my experience has someone like this. This is the person who does everything right except the most important thing, which is to close the sale, right? What are the causes here? They're not clarifying the value proposition. Again, we can train on that. They're not getting beyond surface pain at that account, or they're doing everything right, but with the wrong person at prospects. Somebody who's not in a position to make a buying decision or someone who doesn't have a budget. And again, those are things that we can train on. I'm going to wrap up this way, and then in the remaining time, any other questions or comments. This is the way I think about sales productivity for what it's worth. I think about productivity in sales is a function of three things that are multiplicative, all right? The first is what I call capacity. Now, by capacity, I mean two things. I mean, first, what old school sales managers used to call feet on the street. At the end of the day, how many calls can we make? How many prospects can we get in front of? But by capacity, I also mean the capacity of our people. What are they good at? When they are in front of a customer, what are they good at? Maybe the word there is capability. The second thing is close rate. Capacity says how many shots on goal do we get? Close rate says do we or don't we make a sale? And then the third dimension is what kind of sale do we make? Profit per sale. Now, when you think about productivity this way, you can deconstruct it and it becomes managerial. You know, it points to things you can actually make a difference with. How do you increase sales capacity? Either by getting people to work harder or smarter. And again, working harder counts. Don't discount it. Inside sales is a good example. What the research says, and again, it's getting more and more crowded, it now takes about 8 calls for an inside rep to make contact with someone who has indicated some interest in the category because they went to your website, downloaded a white paper, et cetera. On average, about 8 calls. Most inside reps give up after 5. So what's the message there? Stick with it. Persistence counts. A lot of business is just showing up, as Woody Allen once said. But so does working smarter. More focus on the high impact tasks, prospects, et cetera. How do you increase close rate? This is where segmentation counts. This is where knowing your market counts. Better opportunity and deal selection criteria. What you'll see in one of the chapters of this book is, and it's an example from a tech firm, do you have in your business a deal profile? This is not just who's our customer, but what are the characteristics of that customer? You can read that chunk of the book and see what I mean. But again, in an omni-channel buying world, better account management, better channel or partner management can also help this. And then you increase profit per sale by first and foremost doing all the basics right. I mean, one of the things that impressed me tremendously when I left academia and ran a business for 11 years is how far you can get versus your competitors by doing the basics a little bit better. Don't turn up your nose at that. I mean, again, I want to compliment Sandler. You'll see it in the book. What Sandler calls the upfront contract, you know what I'm talking about, very basic aspect of sales that is usually ignored. Don't ignore those basics, but you also increase profitability and productivity by managing a cycle. I'm not very good at these kinds of slides, but what I'm getting at is what I said earlier. There is no such thing as effective selling if it's not linked to the company's strategy for increasing its value. So it begins with strategy. Tough. Even the world's best sales force ultimately cannot substitute for the lack of a market relevant strategy. It begins with strategy, but then it's about behaviors. How do we translate that into the performance expectations that we use in hiring, training, et cetera? Then planning. There's, again, after sales, if you look at Amazon, you're going to find there's about 70,000 SKUs for planning. My advice is don't read those books. It's basically different jargon every few years for the same basics. A plan is essentially about the actions that we need to achieve the goals and expectations we talk about. monitoring and evaluating. This is where so-called KPIs, key performance indicators, are relevant. And then coaching, compensation, all the things that do affect human behavior to align behavior with those expectations. And what I'm trying to get at here is that it is and should be an iterative process, because at the end of the day, the market doesn't give a darn about you, your company, and your strategy. The market will change for reasons that are basically outside of your control. Pandemic is a good example. Nobody in this room caused the pandemic, but you've got to deal with it. It's your job to adapt to the market, so it has to be iterative. Any final questions or comments? Because then I've got to wrap up. Yep.
In the first slide, you talked about the beginning of the pandemic was 30.
Hey, I'm impressed. You remember my first slide. Good for you.
You talked about 38%, I think, people working from home, and within a year it was down to 20.
Yeah.
As everyone drove into Pittsburgh today, you know, it's the zombie apocalypse. We don't see a lot of people down here. I work at South Point. It's an oil and gas. It's desolate. It's very hard for our guys to set up in-person meetings. I see that change. I'm making that goal. Any tips on really getting out and meet people face to face?
Well, first of all, you're exactly right. The research supports this. This was increasingly true before the pandemic, but for reasons that I think are intuitive to most people, the pandemic has made this a bigger deal. It's harder to get access to customers. It just is. You know, among other things, one of the things the pandemic did, a lot of people got laid off. A lot of people are now just responsible in your customers, not just for doing A, B, and C, but A, B, C, D, E, and F. Their schedule is more fixed. They've got one Zoom meeting after the next. So whether or not we all get vaccinated or not, that is going to remain as an issue for some time. What's the managerial implication? Again, I know this is going to sound a bit like do good and avoid evil, but it's the best I can do. Make the most of the more limited time you have. Just make the most of that. But that issue of access to customers is getting tougher, not easier. That's part of what proliferation of communication media does.
From the talent pool perspective, do you think more people are coming in as candidates for salespeople or less? Meaning like the industry as a salesperson?
Yeah. The honest answer is, I don't know. I don't know, but I'm going, and this is not what you're saying, but I think, and I want to, you know, it's sort of a downer to end this way, but what the hell? I find that a lot of salespeople and sales audiences have a chip on their shoulder. Remember the comedian Rodney Dangerfield? Remember, I can't get no respect. You know, now again, I showed you the data. In academia, sales has long been and still is an undertaught topic. But in America, the two most unpopular professions are politician and media, right? Sales is not there. Sales is somewhere in between. I think the issue is not sales. The issue is the company. At the end of the day, any company has to be worthy of talent, and word spreads. It just spreads. So I don't know, but whatever you can do to make your company a talent magnet, where when the people there talk to others, they say, well, what's it like at XYZ? I say, this is good. This is good. Because even if I leave here, I'm going to be more valuable at the next place. Sales, I don't know. But there won't be a dearth of people that want to make money. That part of human behavior will stay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, think about SaaS models. How many of you use HubSpot? All right. Okay. I knew them when, you know, they were a twinkle in the eye. But, you know, that sort of technology, I think, is at the heart of what we're talking about. What you're going to do is send out via email lists, lots of things, what we used to call white papers, right? Now we call it content marketing. And the notion is that if somebody clicks and downloads, they must be, quote, in the market. Now, that's, by the way, that's a debatable assumption in many businesses. That's one reason that online marketing expenses are rising. Ask yourself, in most Fortune 1000 companies, who has time to surf the web? Is it the person with a budget, or is it some weenie in the basement who's got nothing better, right? But that's the assumption. But if you look at the way that activity is conducted in more and more firms, the technology allows the sales force to do that. In fact, in some of these firms, they've gotten rid of marketing entirely. All I want to point out is that there was a reason we had marketing people. They're not the same job. So when we do that, make sure sales knows what it's doing and stays up to date with that. All right. Now I've got to wrap up, and I'm going to wrap up this way. If you want to learn more, there is a good book. Here's my deal with you, and I mean this sincerely with this group because your questions have been answered. I'm not joking. If you actually read a couple of chapters in this book, I believe my email's on the first slide. Send me an email. Frank, you said X, I agree with this. Here's why. Here's an example. Frank, you said X, I disagree with it. Here's why. Here's an example. I have learned over the years that's the single best way to learn. In the next book, I'm not going to share royalties with you, but I will footnote you. You'll see it here in this book. Think of it as a minor form of immortality, all right? But I welcome your feedback. I want to thank you all for the time. I want to wish you the best of success, not only in your market, but also in your careers and in your life. And my advice is don't confuse your life with your career. That's a loser. But I'm going to leave you with a comment that a guest made in one of my classes last year. After he finished speaking, he said goodbye to the students this way. He said, now you all remember, stay positive, but test negative. Adios.